Welcome. I'm Jim Schoonmaker, Vice President of Programming of the Cornell Club of Washington, which is CCW. We're delighted you could join us here tonight for one of our continuous virtual conversations. And I'd also, before we go too far along, I would like to point out that we're here to talk with the playwright of a play that we'll be attending, hopefully, next Thursday. And for those of you that have not signed up for that, are still interested, we've put the link there in the chat for you there. But tonight is a conversation with the playwright Kenneth Lin. And before we get started here, I'd like to introduce the co-president of the CCW, Annalise Schoonmaker. Annalise.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody tonight. We're really excited to have you here. As mentioned, we're doing virtual programming and in person. So this event kind of goes virtual, and we have an in-person component coming up next week. So thank you again for joining tonight. Ken will be interviewed by Grace Jean, who is club president from 2015 to 2017. Like Ken, she is a similar class. She is class of 2000, and all three of us were artsies. Grace also is a longtime freelance classical music reviewer for the Washington Post. Thank you, Grace. Over to you.
Thank you, Annalise, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Cornell Club of Washington for hosting this event. It is an honor and a delight to be part of this event tonight, and I'm so happy that we're starting to see more and more programs and events being organized by the club. And I am very excited that the club got a block of tickets to see Exclusion, which had its world premiere a few weeks ago at Arena Stage downtown. So before I introduce our playwright, I'd like to also welcome everyone who has tuned in to join us tonight for a conversation with Kenneth Lin, who I'm proud to say is my fellow classmate and a fellow arts and sciences grad from the class of 2000. So Ken hails from New York City, and he is an Emmy-nominated screenwriter and playwright. He is based in LA and is currently an executive producer for Star Trek Discovery and recently signed a deal with CBS Television Studios. Ken got a start in television writing for House of Cards, which earned him the Emmy nomination as well as the Writers Guild of America Award nomination. He has also written for Cinemax, HBO Max's Warrior, CBS's CLARICE, and Starz's SWEETBITTER. As a playwright, Ken has won a number of accolades, including the Princess Grace Award, and his theatrical plays include Warrior Class, Intelligent Slave, and KLEPTOCRACY. And of course, we'll be talking more about his latest play, Exclusion, which was commissioned by Arena Stage as part of its Power Play series. Welcome, Ken, and thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. It's so great to see you.
Yeah, you did your homework.
I'm nothing but a good researcher.
Cornellian.
Yes, the true Cornellian, exactly. Well, so let's start where all Cornellians start when they bump into somebody that they run into from Cornell. Mm-hmm. So we know what year you graduated and which school. So what was your major?
I was a psychology major. Yeah. And when most people hear that, you know, they think, oh, you must be like so good at character, right? That's where the character stuff comes from. But I always tell them that it actually is more helpful with plot, because I was studying like cognitive science and perception and things like that. And I was always looking at psychological experiments. And when you look at a psychological experiment, you have like a given set of parameters. You move these subjects through those parameters, you observe their behavior, and you make some kind of inference about human nature. Well, that's exactly what a screenplay or a play is, right? Except I choose all the parameters, I choose all the subjects. You know, then I come out and I present their behavior. So I always tell people that my initial training for a life in the theater was, you know, sitting in Psych 101.
All right, that is awesome. So there's a class that we may have shared at some point together.
I was a TA for that class as well.
Fantastic. Yeah. That's great. And actually, I never would have made the connection to writing more of the plot versus character, because I automatically went to character as a psychology major.
Yeah.
That is awesome. So the other thing that I did, because I think our paths did not directly cross while we were at Cornell, was
Mhm.
I did pull out that big red Cornellian yearbook that we
Mhm.
got. And I was like, I got to find Ken. I got to see like what he was interested in and what groups he was in and
Mhm.
see where we potentially may have crossed paths. And I
Right.
found that we have a very common connection through music, actually. Although I went the instrumental route and you went kind of the Glee Club and a cappella route. So could you talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about that?
Well, most of the time I spent singing at Cornell was spent in this group called Cayuga's Waiters. And I'm actually, I think, the only person that has ever been in Cayuga's Waiters and in the Hangovers. Like I was in the Waiters for a time, and then I decided to leave to kind of pursue some other things. And then, I ended up wanting to sing a little bit more formally and join the Glee Club. But then once I joined the Glee Club, it was like, oh, well, you have all this a cappella experience. Why don't you come sing with the Hangovers too? So yeah, so I did both.
That
And
is awesome.
and I've had lifelong friendships from all that singing.
Absolutely. So I had to go dig up some old CDs, and guess what I found? I don't know if you can see it.
Oh, it's been a while. I don't recognize these
Yeah,
things.
you're in the cover notes for this one.
Oh,
Clothing
okay.
optional, and this had the Harvard song on it and all sorts of other goodies. So I think I played the heck out of this on my long commutes back and forth
Oh.
on break. So so that was pretty awesome to find that
Funny.
I actually
Yeah.
probably saw you perform. So that's really cool.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. And I have to say, like, the Hangovers, my friends from the Hangovers have flown all over the country to see my plays. They've come to every one of the world premieres, and it's been great. These
Oh, that's great.
characters.
That is awesome. It's such a great group to be a part of, and I know the ties are so strong, even in the
Yeah.
after Cornell part. So that's wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. So I guess two more questions for you about Cornell before we transition over into how you got started and wanting to write and
Mhm.
getting into the television business. So
Sure.
there are two questions. So favorite place at Cornell and favorite class at Cornell.
Favorite place at Cornell? I love the Arboretum. So I would, just spend a lot of time, walking in the Arboretum, and in the gardens. I also learned how to fly fish at Cornell. It was we were required to take a gym class, and fly fishing was one of the gym classes. So I was like, all right, I'll do that. And so a couple of friends and we ended up taking this class, and I would fly fish, in all the gorges. And it was just so much fun, and I still do it today. So I live here by the beach now, so you can go down to Santa Monica and fly fish there, and I've fly fished all over the world, and it all began in a gym class at Cornell. So I guess my favorite spots would be like at the base of some of those waterfall, chasing trout and things like that. And my favorite class, so I'm come from an immigrant family, and people always say, oh, how did you begin? But for me, so much of the journey in America was through school, right? And I say that, like, hey, I learned English here in America, and now I'm an English wordsmith, and progressively, like I can trace back and see, oh, this is where I learned this is where I learned that. So I had a really great time in my freshman writing seminars, for the John S. Knight writing program.
Yes.
One of them was taught by this woman named Jo Miller, who I'm still friends with, who was the head writer for the Samantha Bee Show, and an Emmy award-winning writer. But back then, she was in a PhD program in history, and she taught a class about the formation of a persecuting society in Europe. And there was a lot of interesting writing about that. And I took another class with Jason Stanley, who is a professor at Yale right now and is one of the world's leading experts in fascism. And he taught a class in epistemology, which was also attended by Sam Gold, who is a Tony Award-winning theater director in our year as well. And that's where I met Sam. And so he taught, a class about the philosophy of existence. And I learned a lot about writing in both of those classes. And I learned that, writing is thinking. And yeah, both of those classes and both of those teachers were foundational in my choice of career and my continued articulation of what it means to be a writer.
Fantastic. And it's actually very gratifying for this English major to hear that those classes had such a profound impact on you.
Yeah.
I love to read and write, as you might imagine, as an English lit major, but to hear its impact on folks who may not have had that particular interest or that particular bug already in their system, it's so gratifying to hear.
Yeah. Well, and then there was two really important things at Cornell that continued to set me off on the path. Like my senior year came around and I thought I was going to, apply to a PhD program in psychology and do research, write books and stuff like that. But I ended up but my friends knew that I was interested in writing. And I had a friend who was taking a film class and he asked me if I would write the movie for him. And, as a non-writer, non-filmmaker, I said, okay, sure. And I wrote this movie and we made it at Cornell, and we got a grant from, the Cornell Council for the Arts or something like that. And it was shown at the Herbert Johnson Museum of Art. And I thought, oh my gosh, right? This is so amazing, so exciting. Like this thing came about the second half of my senior year. I was already on one path. And then I wrote this movie and all of a sudden it was shown at this wonderful museum. And I thought, that's what I want to do with my life. But how do I pursue that now when I've already been heading in the direction of a scientist for the last 4 years? So, I had to find a way to buy time. And then I got this email about like prestigious fellowships and things like that. And so I got together with this gentleman named Milton Essman at Cornell, and he helped me apply for a Fulbright scholarship. And because of him, I was able to go off and start my career as a writer on Fulbright. And I got to spend a year writing so that when I came back to the States, I had like a body of work that would then allow me to then apply to the Yale School of Drama and go there and continue my career. So Cornell really had a lot to do with setting me on the path in lots and lots of different ways.
That is awesome. And I was actually going to ask you about the Fulbright and what you did with it. So now we got a little bit of a preview. Did you study somewhere specific overseas?
I studied in Taiwan and in China.
All right.
And, my thought was, okay, I'm going to be a writer and I'm interested in Chinese theater forms and I don't know much about them. So let me go back to the source and learn and things like that. So I traveled around Taiwan and in China, like going to various theater schools and hanging out with people and now I'm writing the Broadway musical for Farewell My Concubine. So it all kind of comes full circle.
Yes, it does. And actually, it's a great segue into Exclusion. So actually, maybe we'll take a pause here. And Jim, if you want to roll the footage we've got just real quick.
Now playing at Arena Stage, a new comedy, Exclusion. Your little book just got greenlit. Chinese, any kind of Asian? My therapist is on. It's not show history. Right. It's show business. It's called Chinese Exclusion. Okay. And the final, the Chinese writers are replacing them with white guys. It's still your script.
I don't know what to say.
So trust me that we'll read this together. Tickets at arenastage.org.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great little teaser for our conversation about Exclusion. So I was wondering actually, before we get to that, because I know you started in television at House of Cards. So maybe we should backtrack just slightly because, that was really kind of your entree into kind of the full entertainment world. And I'd love to ask you a couple of questions about that and how you transitioned over to writing plays and then, certainly we'll get into your work for Broadway too.
Well, I actually, started my life in the theater. My training, my MFA from Yale is in playwriting. So I'm a playwright who, started doing my day job in film and TV. So it's actually the other way around. But in terms of how House of Cards came about, I'd written a play about politics. And, people always think of me as this real political writer now, but I'm not, as interested in politics as I'm interested in people, hence the psychology background. And, but I do think that if you're interested in people, then eventually you have to be interested in politics, because it's how we all kind of organize ourselves. So I'd written this play about politics called Warrior Class, and it was in New York right when House of Cards was coming about, and it was a minor hit in New York, and the showrunner for House of Cards read it and said, "Oh, this guy knows politics," and put me on the show. But I didn't know politics at all, to tell you the truth. And there's a woman in the class of 2000 named Allison Bailey, who is the chief of staff at the World Trade Center, and her husband was involved in politics. And so when I started to write about politics, he actually sat me down and said, "These are the books that you need to read, and this is how things happen." Because I was writing about politics and real estate speculation and things like that. So just another one of these tendrils of how like whenever I need help and I don't know what I'm doing, some Cornellian offers me a safety hatch.
You got to love that Cornell connection.
Yeah, I use it often.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, I know Allison, so this is like really good, because we're getting a little taste of our like pre-2000 reunion here in a couple of years. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
All right. So you lived in Baltimore while you were filming, but actually, I guess you grew up in New York City and then transitioned. You traveled the world, visited Taiwan, China, and then came back. So what would you say was like the how do you gather all of that string and bring it into what you do on a daily basis?
In terms of being an artist, there's lots of different like trainings that I have to put myself through, right? You have to have a certain kind of antenna to the world, right? And really try to be open to the world and new experiences. And I think, one cultivates that by just being interested in what's going on. So I do spend a lot of time just, like reading everything that I can get my hands on. I think that, but like one of the, like, I think there has to be this willingness to change and this willingness to be inoculated in a sense, right? Like I always tell students and people that the greatest pleasure of being a writer is actually changing every time you write something. And then the task is really to be very stringent with yourself in terms of looking at yourself and understanding where you need to change. So you could go pursue that. So that requires the cultivation of self, and then on top of that, I think there's the real cultivation of craft, right? There is this, in the language arts, it really is like how you assemble a string of words together and have an actor say it, at pace and with a certain kind of, at pace and volume, which elicits a response in an audience, right? And that's the craft of what I do for a living, right? I craft a response from people who observe another person behave a certain way. And I think that involves a love of language, certainly, but it also involves the love of the craft of the actor and the other people that you collaborate with.
Absolutely. And I've noticed in your body of work, you've written such a wide spectrum of topics and interesting characters. Could you talk a little bit about what inspires you, and then we can get more into Exclusion and how that all came about?
What inspires me? Well, I mean, at a certain level, when you're a professional, what inspires you, and I know this is a glib answer, but what inspires you is the paycheck, right?
Absolutely.
Like I am paid as a professional writer to make this work. So really you can give me any topic to write about, and I am able to bring my artistry to that topic. But I take a certain amount of pride in being able to write about in various genres. Like if you do look at my body of work, I've done prestige drama, I've done action, I've done sci-fi. If you count CLARICE as horror, I've even done horror. And I do YA material as well. And it's interesting that like no matter where I go, there are people that are sort of very entrenched in that genre. And there's me, and I sort of float, right? Because I'm the story expert. And when you can sort of like, when you can push through all the specifics and you can get to the fundamental story, I guess that's where I excel. And I guess there's only so many stories there actually are in the world.
Right. And you talked about the idea of being able to change. And I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you had to change, if at all, to write Exclusion, and what was the driving force behind this particular play?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I got this commission, right? And I'd been going out to lunch a lot on this reputation as this guy who wrote like, hard edge political potboilers, House of Cards, all these other things. So this theater has this commissioning program where they ask playwrights to write about decades of power in the life of America. So of course they came to me, and I was like, oh, I'm going to do my typical thing, right? I'm going to write something intense and bloody and blah, 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 blah. And I started to write this historical accounting of the Chinese Exclusion Act and a lot of the, anti-Asian violence that surrounded it, and, try to make, create all these tendrils that went backwards in time and forward in time, and say, and everyone would, and in my mind, I was like, everyone's going to watch this and say, oh, this is where we are today. And, I'm going to change the world or whatever. But I kept on writing these very, very boring plays. And I would, just be writing, and I would basically like be falling asleep while I was typing because the plays were so bad, right? They were so terrible, so bad. I never, I would not have asked you to go see any of these plays. And I wrote several drafts. And finally, I was about to call Molly Smith and ask her to take the commission back because I didn't know how to write this play. And but then I was like, Ken, you're being such a baby, because it's your job to do more, right? It's your job to really like, if this play is not coming, it's because you're not being brave enough and you're not working hard enough. And you're not doing the thing that I said of really needing to look at where you need to change. So I turned it into a comedy, right? Like I couldn't get this drama to work. And I tried to turn it into a comedy, and that's sort of where I needed to go in terms of my craft, because it's a very particular craft of writing comedy. Once I went there, the play wrote itself very quickly. I wrote the play in about a week.
Wow, that's amazing.
A week plus several years.
Well, so when I was trying to do some research and learn more about Exclusion, I was actually very surprised to find that it was a humorous play. Kind of like, you do think it's a very serious topic, and it resonates, especially today, as you alluded to. And, maybe a comedy was the last thing from my mind when I first was starting to learn more about the play.
Mm-hmm.
But it's fascinating to hear that once you did that, kind of flipped it 180 and turned it on its head, that it just kind of came out. So could you talk a little bit more about that process and what that must have been like?
Well, I think that there is this real literary history that maybe we forget a little bit, but that like so much of the comedies and so much of its absurdism was born out of an inability of the craft to really speak to events, historical events that and atrocities that were so profound that the mind really doesn't know how to write about it. You know, it's absurd to be a human being, period, in the face of such things. And I think that like in our sort of modern understanding of comedy, we forget about that tradition, you know, and it's kind of like we have to like relearn over and over and over again. And, you know, especially out here in LA, I don't think, for the most part, most people are writing thinking, oh, this has to be funny because the situation is so absurd. Although, you know, I watch Succession these days and I think to myself, these people are clowns, right? This is a full-on comedy. Everybody wants to talk about how much of a tragedy it is, but it looks very much like a comedy to me. And, you know, it's absurd that, you know, I think everyone wants to say, oh, these are such bad people, but truly, like at the heart of it, these are such dumb people. And they're at the nexus of so much power, right? So there's a lot of absurdities that are happening in the world right now. And I think sometimes we forget that comedy is the best way to talk about absurdities because, you know, there's that quote, right? He who can convince you to believe absurdities can convince you to commit atrocities, right?
Right.
So I think the two are really linked.
Right. Absolutely. So this next question is a little bit more personal.
Mhm.
You mentioned that you are the son of immigrant parents. So I was wondering how much of you is reflected in the protagonist for Exclusion, in Katie, or there are other characters too. Malcolm, her husband, who is a director, or maybe a director wannabe, and Viola, the actress. So I'm just kind of curious, you know, how much of yourself do you actually, do we see as the audience reflected in these characters in your play?
Well, I think any play that you'll ever see from a writer, they are writing themselves, a version of themselves on stage. So every character that you're going to see on stage is a version of me. Now, in terms of the question of like, does this play comport with my lived experience? I think very much it does, right? I think there's a lot of you know, chatter out there right now about how this is such a satire and a send-up of Hollywood. But I think the real truth of the matter is that it's not an inaccurate portrayal of Hollywood, especially from the vantage point of somebody who was working in the business when there really weren't a lot of Asian faces around. And when I say there weren't a lot of, I mean there weren't any. And that's still true today. So, you know, a lot of it is about my experience. And the absurd, sorry to be redundant, the absurd experience of like being a sentient person who really cares about the craft and cares about what they're doing, and then being in an environment in which being Asian and being, you know, a minority is so deeply misunderstood that it doesn't even exist to the people that are in power around you. So I would say this is a deeply personal play, and you know, it's probably funny because it's true.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I know all of us here are probably very eager to see it, and I wonder if you could tell us from your perspective as a playwright, are there any particular moments in the play that you want us to make sure we see? And I know it's hard as, you know, like a first time observer.
Well, I mean, I think that's, of course, I want you to, well, I mean, you know, the play is a service from me to you, not the other way around, right? So I definitely don't have any feelings of like, I want you to do something, right? I've written the play to give to you. Like I'm from a restaurant family, right? So, when I grew up, I was always taught like the people are coming and we need to give them the best of everything that we have. Like it's our job to nourish people. So I very much take that to heart when I'm making work for audiences, right? It's my job to be grateful for you for coming and to try to nourish you with the best that I have. Whether or not, the spices are right or the recipe is right, I leave that up to you. But it's my intention to nourish. An interesting phenomenon has been happening, though, that I think is really kind of remarkable. The play is centered on Asian characters. Asian actors are on stage for the entire time, and it's very much a story about Asian Americans. But I've been getting a lot of questions now about how the story is the story of the white character that's at the center of the play, which I think is kind of interesting. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about, you're the first group that I'm talking to, like, since this phenomenon has been happening. So I'm actually curious as to like your take on that. Because like somebody even stopped me at a talkback and said, the two characters, and one is Harry, who's played by Josh Stamberg, who's a wonderful, amazing actor who I'm sure you've seen in movies and everything. And the other is, the two big characters are played by Josh, and the other character is played by Caroline, who is of Asian descent. And I got a question of like, well, why does that Asian person come out and take the bow at the end? Because this audience member perceived that both of those characters were the lead of the play. And I was like, you have one character who is on stage for 100% of the play, and you have another character who's on stage for less than a third of the play. Yet in your perception, you think that both of those characters are the co-leads of the play. Like, why is that? So I'm curious about this phenomenon because it was shocking to me at first, but I've continued to hear about it more and more. And I love Josh's performance, and it was, I was really thrilled that he came all the way to DC to do the play. But it was amazing to me that the disparity of like 100% versus a third, but they're equated.
That's really fascinating. And I guess we just got a homework assignment for you. So we'll definitely keep an eye out for that. That's a very interesting phenomenon. And I guess in this day and age where everybody is maybe hyper attuned to division of race and all of these discussions, I guess maybe people are just a little bit more sensitive to it, or could be looking for it. So I don't know, maybe this audience has other views.
I think this is back to my like original interest in perception, right? When I was at Cornell, I was studying perception, and I'm sort of fascinated by how the perception of it all. But anyway, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to know what you found to be the most challenging in trying to write Exclusion, aside from the fact that you had to do this 180 and when it wasn't working, but then all of a sudden it did work. But even as a playwright trying to create a play using your craft, and all of a sudden you fall into the solution, what sorts of challenges did you still have to overcome?
I think that the act of making a comedy is really, really different than making a drama. If you're writing a drama and everybody's quiet, you're like, oh, maybe it's working, right? But you don't really know. But if you're writing a comedy and nobody is laughing, you really, really know. So a lot of, so like we had the play and everybody loved the play. And then once we started to work in production, there was the realization that like the fine tuning is really what matters for comedy and kind of everything, but like the fine tuning of the comedy was so fun, number one, but also like deeply challenging. And we also like to look at jokes as things that exist sort of discreetly. But eventually once audiences come in, you realize that jokes musically have a lot to do with like momentum and expectation and the satisfaction of completing a pattern or the joy of, you know, completely upturning it, right? So it was also like, how do I keep this sort of this organism of a comedy alive with an audience throughout? Like, how do I make sure that we're on to the next bit before you're done laughing? And how do we build that wave of laughter, which is really interesting. Yeah, I like comedy. I'm gonna do more.
Fantastic. So would you consider this to be your first true comedy then as a playwright, or are there other works that you did before that we would?
I've always written like funny, but I would, well, I mean, that's not up for me to judge, but I will say that this one, it is like a different kind of play for me, and an opening up of you know, my craft, and made me realize I have a lot to learn, but also made me realize I've learned a lot. Like out here in Hollywood, I do a lot of rewriting scripts, which means that I write a lot, and I rewrite a lot, and I take other people's work and I change it a lot. And sometimes that can be frustrating work, but from what I've seen of Exclusion, I've realized like this amount of writing, that sort of like 10,000 hours Malcolm Gladwell talks about, like has really given me a lot of different facility. I never really understood how my Hollywood screenwriting affected my theater work until Exclusion.
Huh. Is there one example that you would point to?
I wouldn't know. I don't know if there's, you know, I mean, there's definitely sort of like human sort of dialogue, right? Like I used to write about these big ideas, and all the characters are sitting around a table, chewing the scenery and talking about big ideas. And, you know, I have a lot of scenes where the characters are just talking about themselves and their lives, and big ideas are creeping in there. But you know, that might be a function of just getting older also, because when you're young, you see the problem, right? And then when you get a little bit older, you see how you contribute to the problem, and you're a little cog inside the problem. So I used to be writing about the problem, and now I'm writing about like my particular position in the problem and how I can really use some oil over here, and you know, maybe we can run this thing a little bit slower or something like that. So yeah.
Going back to your theme of change then, right?
Yeah.
A little bit. So what's it like seeing your play, the production of your play emerge from something that you've written? Because I know there's a very specific craft for writing and how you want something to unfold, but then there's the interpretation part of it, of how a director sees your play or reads it, interprets it, and then translates it to the stage. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe the role of the playwright in all this, because you do play a pretty big role
Right.
in that.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't write novels, right? I never chose to have that kind of relationship with the audience. I always wanted to write things that other people would get to perform and create. And, you know, like, I guess that when I look at literature, I'm beginning to sort of see it, you know, in terms of how insistent the art form is, right? Because like I was watching a movie after I was in rehearsal for a while, and I went back and watched a movie, and I was like, wow, this movie, and it was directed by Steven Spielberg, I think it was The Fabelmans. And I was like, oh, this is very interesting, because film in a lot of ways is the art of insistence. I'm insisting that you view the story through this particular lens. I'm insisting that you view the story through this particular angle. And theater is really not like that, right? Like you as the audience, you sit in your seat, and please stay in your seat, and don't switch around seats, but you're sitting in your seat, but you get to decide what part of the story you're looking at. You get to decide you know, where you are. And I guess I'm just not particularly interested in the art of insistence. I'm interested, I always say that like a play is like a recipe, and I invite people to come and cook it and how they please. So I like, you know, like when you write a play, what's fun is when they travel around and you get to see lots of different versions of them. And I really take a lot of joy in that, and seeing how other productions have come up with what they do. So like, that's, for me, that's when the art really happens. Yeah.
And I would think a lot of people on here probably agree with that assessment. It's a lovely way of putting it. I guess with the silver screen, it is insistence, because you have only one perspective. You see one cut of the final product, whereas theater, every night could be completely different and new and fresh, and you get a different take on it every night, even though it's fundamentally the same play.
Oh, well, I'm really excited that you're seeing the play in this iteration, because, you know, the stage manager sends me a rehearsal report every night. And, you know, I keep on reading about, oh, they're really finding the play now. You know, a lot of moments in the play that we worked with the actors on so much. And even opening night, I'm like, oh, we're 60% there. Or, oh my God, that's a really funny joke, but we never get a laugh there. Right? You're starting to read in the rehearsal reports, oh, they figured it out. We're getting consistent laughs on that line now. So I'm glad you're getting a chance to see it as it develops.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I'm super excited about that. And I know everybody else on the Zoom is as well. I'm going to take a quick pause to see if there are any questions out there. I know I've been asking a lot of questions of you, but I'm sure our audience probably has a few. So I don't see anything yet in the chat, but please
Grace,
don't be shy.
Grace, we do have one. I think the way it's set up, they sent it to me here, but I'll just read it.
Okay.
Kenneth, how do you manage to navigate between so many genres without feeling out of your depth in any one?
Well, who's to say I don't feel out of my depth in any one? Is
Just for man.
yeah. No, I mean, I feel out of my depth generally in life. So how do I navigate? But I think that it's about just riding the wave of saying, I'm here, you know, this is what's in front of me right now. How do I find myself in it? How do I find what's special about it inherently that's outside of myself? And how do I bring those two things together? But most of it isn't like, I think one of the biggest parts of the job, and the most fun and the easiest part of the job in a way, is appreciating what you're working on, and really, you know, seeing the depths of it. I think so many times, like writers who writing assignments, they get something and they have to say, oh my God, this is what I have to fix. But for me, I always try to think, why is this good? What's it up to? And what's sort of neat is now I'm sort of venturing into the world of Star Trek and things like that have such intense fan bases. You know, I joke with some of my Star Trek writers. I'm like, 5,000 years from now, when the aliens really do come down here, right, and they study what we're doing after AI has completely decimated the planet, they're going to say the Star Trek thing. I think this was Gilgamesh. This was the story that has been told for all this time. And you know, like, how do you like? And I was never a Star Trek fan before. My wife is the Trekkie of the family. Like, when I got the Star Trek job, she was like, you finally made something of yourself. But I've come to really sort of appreciate like what it is and what it does for people. So I think, you know, like, that's how I don't get lost. I come in and I enjoy, number one, right? And then, like, once I've learned how to enjoy something, then I get to work on it. Because if you haven't taught yourself how to enjoy it yet, you don't have the right to really go in and change.
Thank you for the question from the audience, and keep them coming. And in the meantime, I actually want to change
Grace,
topics.
we have
yeah,
one,
go ahead.
We get this one in from Art. He was
Yep,
curious
go
about,
for it.
has the play changed much from opening night to now? If so, how?
From opening tonight to now, I haven't seen it. You know, I left the day after opening night, so I won't go back and see it until closing. Ideally, the play, you know, like the way it's supposed to work is you open and then the play is set and you can't change it anymore and things like that. But, well, I guess my other way of answering that question is to say that, like, up until opening night, I guess in a way it was my play. And once opening night happens, it's the actor's play. You know, like it's my play until the production happens, and then it's the director's production, right? And then once the director and I leave, it's the actor's show. So they're gonna know that show better than I ever knew it. So, you know, so I think it's probably changed that way. Like you've, the other beautiful thing is, like, you know, to have actors get to deepen into a role like that over the course of 6 weeks. You know, I think that's probably changed a lot that way.
Great. Thank you for the question from the audience, and please do keep them coming. I'll ask maybe one or two more, and then I'll take another pause to see if anybody else has a question. So on this note of how a play evolves with each production, are you finding that, maybe not with Exclusion quite yet, with your other plays, with different actors coming in to play these roles, do you see that the play takes on a different sort of life? And I think this actually gets touched upon in Exclusion a little bit, in how people interpret or how they maybe tweak things slightly. Maybe the Exclusion one is probably not the best scenario, because they do take it right and change it completely for the purposes of what we perceive to be as Hollywood. But I guess from the theatrical point of view, are there any instances that you can think of where you did go back and see your play and maybe, wow, it just changed dramatically from what either you originally intended or how you thought it would unfold and evolved?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, you know, like, I think if I haven't had the experience of seeing something that has totally changed, but I have had the thought to myself, like, am I a much better writer now? And if I had the chance to rewrite that play from scratch now, would it be a better play? Right. And I've, I often tell myself that story of, oh, I'm not good yet. It'll be the next one where I really establish my craft. But there's all kinds of problems in this. And when I get better, those won't be problems anymore. And the next play will be better, and the next play will be better. And I've had the experience now of going back and looking at some of those plays and saying, like, wow, I couldn't write this right now. Who is this guy? Like, the work is good. The work is, the work is what it is, and it's just different every time around. So I know that's like a roundabout way of answering your question, but it's, now as I've getting a little bit long in the tooth in the business, I'm starting to be able to kind of like get a full sense of myself as a writer, and sort of not be so critical of that younger guy, but able to look at that work and say, oh, that had its own integrity of that time, and I appreciate it. I mean, I work with the composer Jason Robert Brown a lot, right? And Jason has this huge play in New York right now called Parade, which is a play that he wrote when he composed when he was 25 years old. And that's what he won his first Tony for, his first play, right? And he won the Tony Award. And now 25 years later, it's being revived. And I fingers crossed. But I do think that it's got a great chance of winning Best Revival this year, right? And it's been amazing for me to watch Jason sort of relive that project, which is as vital now, obviously, as it was back then, but 25 years have passed. So I don't know, it's like this great testament to the life of a work and the life of an artist. Yeah, everything comes back, and
it does.
Everything mattered.
That's wonderful. I'll do a quick with Jim to see if we have any questions.
Well, I have one. What would you advise budding playwrights?
Well, I think this is my advice generally for all writers, which is write the way you talk. Because, most people, when they sit down, if they were to say the words that they wrote down on the paper, you would think that they have aphasia or something like that, right? Like it doesn't make sense. And what I say is, if you really want to, because again, writing is thinking, right? Every thing you write is a verbal piece of logic art. And if the logic doesn't make sense, the writing is no good. And you can do an acid test on whether or not your writing makes sense, which is if you say it out loud to another person and they don't understand what you've said, then it's probably not good writing. And I know there's lots of technical writing that could get in the way of that. So if it's not technical writing, or if it's not a specific kind of form of technical writing, then the rules, I think that's generally the rule. So I would say spend a lot of time reading what you say out loud, and seeing how it feels. In that line, I think it's also great to take some acting classes, because actors really have to live with those words in their mouths. So actors are often the best writers there are out there. And one of the best writing classes I ever took was I witnessed an acting class when I was at Yale. And I was watching these scenes and I felt like nothing's happening in the scene. And the teacher stopped the class and she said, "How was your character winning the scene? How was your character winning the scene?" Both characters need to feel like they won the scene when they end the scene. How is that happening, right? And then both actors played it that way and everything came alive. And then I thought to myself, okay, well then I need to write scenes that help both actors on stage do that. So I would say take an acting class, read what you say out loud. What else? I think, enjoy your music, whatever music you like, because there is a music to writing. Ideas land better when you write them musically. And you care about people's souls when you care about the music that's inside of them. So, I would say really study music, right? And see what you like about it. Yeah.
It's great advice. I see in the chat, Jim, that there are maybe 2 other questions.
Yes, actually, we have one from Elizabeth. We were at a 4-character play in DC recently. I attended to talk back with some of the cast. I was struck that one actor felt the audience is an important member of the cast. Is that your feeling?
Is the audience an important member of the cast? Well, I would have loved to have heard that actor's complete answer to really understand what he's talking about. What does he say? What does he mean? I'm trying to unpack what I think that actor is trying to say when he says an actor would not do a play for an empty theater, right? I mean, I guess that's just an act, or not, maybe, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but I do feel like most actors get into it because, well, I don't know, I will say that because I guess I'm saying the same thing of my craft is the craft of stringing these words together and telling an actor to do something with it so that an audience will react.
Yeah, there's a
So
comment.
in terms of another member of the cast, I think that's an interesting way of putting it, but that's his process. So he must have some way of thinking it. I will say that the endeavor is not complete without the audience, and doesn't exactly matter without the audience, maybe.
Yeah, I think the comment was, she said, I think he meant the audience reactions affect the cast on stage.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, the audience will let you know if you're connecting or not. And if what you're doing is truthful, because if what you're doing isn't truthful, then it's not nourishing and they'll reject it.
Great. We got thumbs up from Elizabeth. So Jim, any other questions?
A question about your parents' thoughts.
My parents' thoughts.
We sent you to Cornell and you're right.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was very challenging. Like the day I drove home from Cornell, I remember my father, you know, was driving the car, and I had, you know, been sort of saying, hey, I think I'm going to be a writer, you know, and I think my father, before I graduated from school, like really didn't want to say too much about it, but we were driving home from school. We were in Scranton or in the Delaware Water Gap or something like that. And he said to me, I forbid you from being a writer. You may not be a writer. And my father is a Chinese immigrant, and was sort of used to children really listening to their parents. So I think he thought to himself, well, I'm going to lay down the law, and you know, and too bad for Kenneth. He's just not going to get to be a writer. And I turned to him and I said, you know, I don't think you can prevent me from doing anything I want to do. I don't think you can actually forbid me from becoming a writer. And that was a mind-blowing experience. That was not what he was expecting. And I don't think, like, I think immigrants come here, they build a life, and they say to themselves, my children will have a better life than the life that I had. And that is going to look like them buying the house that's next to me and doing exactly what I want them to be and growing up to be exactly what I want. And I think no immigrant ever says to themselves, well, I'm going to go to another country and my child is going to be rooted in that country now. And he's going to feed from the terroir of that country, and he's going to be of that country. And the more he thrives there, the further away, in a way, he or she will, or they will drift from me. And I don't think immigrant parents, and what parent would ever be prepared for that, really, I think. So there was a strange phenomenon in which, like, the more successful I became as an English wordsmith, the feeling was the further apart I drifted from them. And I think now as we get older, that has helped, right? But the fact of the matter is, like, you know, I've created a life for myself and for my own family now in a language that's different from the language that we all spoke when I was little. Like, I remember a time looking around the world and hearing English and not understanding what people were saying. And, you know, and I look at our lives and I think, oh my God, how did things change so much? I have a family portrait of the time that we all came together and we were all in this restaurant together. And it was us against this big world that we don't understand. And now everybody has gone to different parts of the world. And it's just very, very different. So how do, like, my parents feel about it? I think they feel about my playwriting life like all the things they feel about their immigrant journey to America. You know, all the things that they're happy about, all the things they didn't expect, and all the things that they don't understand and wish they understood better. But also, like, deeply understand, because it is their only, you know, we all get one life and that's our experience of it. So I guess, you know, we have the full experience of it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for the question. I actually, you know, being the daughter of immigrants, I can relate to some of that. And I think we're both in kind of the arts realm and blazing different trails in our respective fields. And it's awesome to see how successful we've become. And we're our own worst critics, and I think our parents are also critics in their own right as well. And I think deep down they're always very proud of what we do.
Oh,
and,
yeah, totally.
yeah.
Like my parents came, and saw the play, and they were like, "We don't understand how you do this." And I'm like, "Where do you think I learned it from?"
Yeah.
Like the bravery to pick up your entire life and go into the void, right? The willingness to try to grow something and build something in the void.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm getting the signal to wrap up, but I actually wanted to ask you one final question, and it's actually about your next project. So you alluded to it, you're adapting Farewell, My Concubine for Broadway theater. So can you give us a little preview of what that's all about and how things are going on that front?
Well, Farewell, My Concubine, I don't know if any of you know this movie, but it's possibly the most popular movie in Asia. It came out in the early 1990s, and it won Best Foreign Picture. And I personally remember it because it traveled like wildfire through like the Chinese immigrant community in New York City. And this is back then where like every week I had to go with my grandmother into Chinatown so that she can go to the video cassette store, right? And like she would get these Chinese videos, and there was this movie coming out of China called Farewell, My Concubine, 霸王别姬. And like I was just like, I remember coming home from school and just being told, you have to go watch this movie right now, right? And I never had that experience before. And it was just everybody in New York who was a Chinese immigrant was watching this movie at the time. And it's about the Peking Opera. And it's about these two characters who play roles in the most sort of illustrious opera in Peking Opera called 霸王别姬, which is about this emperor, the emperor of Zhou, and his concubine. And the movie is a really interesting movie, and it's about these actors who get these roles from when they're children in this theater school, and they build their lives together, and in a sense they fall in love with each other, but the love is very star-crossed. And it's all against the background of the major upheaval in China, which saw China collapse from imperial China to nationalist China, and then into communist China. So it was exactly the upheaval that sent my family in this Chinese diaspora to all these different countries, because my family went from China to Burma to Hong Kong to Taiwan to Laos to Argentina to finally New York, right? So it's like an actual story about the diaspora that sent the events that led to the diaspora that sent my family traveling to find a new home. But it was also about the arts, which were so important to my grandmother, right? My grandmother. And so we watched that together, and she was able to say, wow, this is the China that I grew up in. These are the shows that I was able to see. And I never thought that you would ever get a chance to see it, but here we are watching a movie about it, right? And now, like 30 years later, to be adapting that into when my agent first called me about it, I said, do not let anybody else interview on this project. This is my project. Nobody else is allowed to write this with me. So I mean, it's so insanely important to me that I'm working on this right now. And the director who's directing it is a guy named Moises Kaufman, who is one of the leading lights of the American theater. He's got another play in DC right now called Here There Are Blueberries, which I suggest that you all go see. So Moises is directing it. Mimi Lian, another Chinese theater artist who won the MacArthur Genius Award, is designing the sets. And I just turned in our next draft of the book this morning, like maybe an hour before getting on with you. And we're about to workshop it in New York next week. So it's making its way, but we've been working on this thing for 7 years. Musicals just take forever.
Wow.
Yeah.
Awesome. It's very different than Exclusion, I guess, right? Then.
Yeah, they're all different.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, Ken, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an amazing conversation, and truly appreciate your time and all the insights. And I can't wait to see your play next week. So
Yeah.
for everyone on the call, make sure you sign up for tickets if you haven't already. They're available in the CCW block. And of course, we will be posting this discussion on our YouTube channel. So
Hey, well, stay in touch. You all know how to get a hold of me. And if you ever come out to California, let me know.
will do. Thanks so much, Ken.
Take care, everyone.
All right. Bye.